All right, we're having some technical difficulties with our marketing lead, so I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. This is Bruce Roton. This is a continuation of the intruder hunting introduction. We started it a few weeks ago. This is part 2. We'll talk about data collection and analysis, and also intruder eviction. So before we get started, a quick word from legal. This is not a sales presentation. This is solely educational. Content and opinions in this presentation are attributable to me only. So in the case that I am caught or captured, the secretary will disavow all knowledge of my act. Never mind, wrong script. But I think you guys get the idea. So let's start with a quick recap of the last session. We'll talk about collecting data, what to look for in that data, and data reduction techniques. And we'll look at leveraging an integrated threat and risk management architecture to facilitate intruder hunting by refining the huntscape. Then we'll look at how to report to management and also the eviction of intruders. So as I said last time, intruder hunting. Intruder hunting is not the same as threat hunting. Just say that threats are planners of mischief, whereas intruders are perpetrators of mischief. There's basic components to it. We'll need to define the program, the scope, set up baselines and standards, basic blocking and tackling for security, then select our targets through a huntscape process using risk assessments and threat intel, then monitor those targets, identify and report on intrusions, and then plan for the eviction and remediation. We talked about last time recovery point plans for the target systems. In other words, how much can you lose? What is the acceptable loss? And then a reporting trust plan, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today. We also talked about defining suspicious, because you can't look for suspicious until you define suspicious within the context of your environment. I'm not going to go through these again. We talked about these last time, but the core is the concept that you have to really know your company's business, their data, and their processes in order to define what is suspicious within your company's environment. And this is where we left off last time. We'll need to look at threat intelligence, DNS monitoring and analysis, network monitoring, reconnaissance, and reconnaissance is key to understanding who's looking at you and planning an attack, setting up intruder traps, honeypots, deception networks. Then we'll get into the details of log monitoring, how to analyze the logs, what to look for in memory and on the disk, and then searching the registry, also processes and system services monitoring. And then we'll talk a little bit about application logs and maybe building purpose-built investigation triggers, and then deriving that huntscape tuning through the integrated security management. So let's look at threat intel first. So there's a lot of different sources for threat intel: systems, employees, partners, industry, and data classes. These are things that you can look for on the open network, internet, and also dark web, social media, open source intel. And I'll give you a few examples. One of the places I used to look at when I was doing penetration testing was help desks. And people go to help desk or help forums, and they'll put in things like, I work at such and such company, I've got Windows version, whatever, and here are the patches I've got on, I'm trying to load this other piece of software on there, and here's some problems I'm running into. Well, they just told me everything I need to know about the versions they're running, the patch levels they're running to help me break into their environment. Would also see things about in social media. I'll give you a great example. Some years ago, I was working with a gas company, and they were offshore, and I was looking at some of their employees' records, and I found the daughter of the CEO had a post, meeting dad at our favorite restaurant, getting seats by the sidewalk, and she listed the restaurant in Venezuela. We had to point out to her father, that's the kind of information that will get you both kidnapped or killed. Let's not have that meeting. So looking for these types of things on social media, dark web, open source intel is very useful. Also, DNS reputations, IP reputations, and understanding the threat actor profiles. What tools do they normally use? What campaigns are they running? How do they go after the data? What specific types of data are they looking for? And then deception systems intelligence. Also really useful if you deliberately set up vulnerabilities in a deception network, you can find out who's targeting you and what types of malware they're using, and then link that back to particular threat actors and campaigns. A lot of times people ask, how valuable, what do we really get out of threat intelligence? And if you'll indulge me for just a couple of minutes, I think in 5 quick examples, I can show you the value of one tiny bit of threat intelligence, how it can completely change the story in your environment. First, I'm guessing most people know what this is, but actually the way it was defined in the movie was being the most powerful, technologically advanced system in the galaxy. And yet, what caused this disaster and the first John Dykstra zero-G explosion? Well, lack of threat intelligence is what I would claim. First, here's an example. A self-mobilizing sentient memory stick was allowed to access the corporate servers from a random port on the campus. But if they had had this one bit of threat intel, the rebels, viable threat actors, like we talked about last time, are planning intent to steal the Death Star plans and droids. Weapons will be used in the plan. They would have locked down all those ports. And then the droids were simply allowed to leave. This was a monitor-only policy. My thought, of course, is when the guy on the bridge said, there's no life forms on that escape pod, I think you just lost an expensive escape pod. What's a laser blast going to cost you? They should have blown it out of the sky. Would have been a short movie. The rebels, viable threat actors, are planning to steal the plans, and droids will be used. They would have known not to look for life forms on the escape pod. And of course, the Death Star plans were stored unencrypted. Again, a policy failure, but the lack of threat intelligence led to that. They should have been encrypted based on the fact they knew they were trying to steal them. And also, you all know what this is, and you know what this is other than just a bad actor. But here's the real point. The corporate authentication was a white helmet. You wear the white helmet, you must belong here. No badge, no code, no near-field RFI, no implants. Nothing but a uniform and a white helmet. It's kind of lame for the most technologically advanced system in the galaxy. But again, out one little bit of threat intel. The rebels are planning to sneak onto your ship disguised as stormtroopers. And the last example. A critical event, direct access to the server room or reactor. You'll notice no force field, no bars, no fence, not even a screen door. And yet, if they'd have had that one bit of threat intel, the rebels are planning to launch a bomb up your exhaust pipe, maybe they would have done something more about that. In the end, this was a fundamental failure of threat intelligence. And I'd have to ask, who's responsible for this mess? The Chief Information Security Officer, of course. So, on to more serious topics. Let's look at DNS. Some things you can look for with DNS. First off, I'd look for any communications with IPs that don't have a related NS lookup query. It may be legit, or it could be a fixed IP address put in by a hacker. Develop a whitelist for server-based NS lookups. Of course, there are a lot of servers that should never make a DNS query. Another thing to look for is fast flux domains. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, it is a constantly changing IP address for a single DNS domain. Typically, they'll use less than a few hundred seconds. So they'll change the IP address for a single DNS domain. Yes, I get it. That could be load sharing in some cases when it's 8 or 10 IP addresses. But when it's hundreds of addresses, that's somebody using a botnet to try and hide their IP address. Another thing to look for is to track create dates and domain history. I think we mentioned it in the last call that if someone's got a domain name of less than a few days old, they're too young to be talking to you. Another thing you want to look at is the ownership over time. You might see an IP address and a domain name and look that up and see where that IP is, see it's registered to a data center, outsourcing data center in Canada. And you think, well, I don't have anything against the Canadians. But if you were to look at the ownership of that over time, you might find that domain name was before that in Argentina for a month or two. And before that, Iran for 6 months. And then Kazakhstan before that. Maybe you don't want to be talking to these people. Thinking about net flow analysis. Obviously, you can catch iTunes, web radio, and some abusive things. But as you start getting more granular and doing a higher percentage of capture on the stats, you can catch communications to restricted or suspicious locations, like we said last time. Maybe communications to places like Seychelles, which is a small resort island off the coast of Somalia, and about the only thing there is hotels and proxy servers for bad guys. Also, unexpected banned protocols and encrypted channels. Almost every time I've done a network analysis for a customer, we've always found protocols that they say are blocked by the firewall. Unfortunately, the place we were sensing these communications was outside of their firewall in the router. So this is also a good way to find out if your firewall is actually blocking the protocols you think it is. But as you get more granular, you can catch the really interesting stuff out on the edges of the bell curve where life gets really interesting. Rare communications, slow but regular communications, looking for things where a system does a phone home message every 48 hours or every 2 weeks with a small packet, a small payload. And also new behaviors and connections. As I said last time, why did the payroll server suddenly wake up this morning and decide it was a good idea to go talk to people on the internet? And then you can start mining for data signatures. Once you get a wealth of traffic, you can start looking at the packet size within the sequence, and you can fingerprint potential malware that's being downloaded. Another part of that is looking at the conversation timing. Sometimes specific malware has conversation timing. I receive a packet, 4 seconds later, I'm going to respond. It waits 50 seconds and then sends me 3 packets, and then I respond. So looking at the conversation timing, the flags and window size, you can also fingerprint the types of systems that are talking to you. Another interesting area is reconnaissance monitoring. So there's 2 sides to every equation, although they may not always be equal. You've identified all the systems that you think are potential targets, but it's still helpful to know who is targeting your organization and what they think is a target. For instance, the air conditioning control system. A lot of breaches happen because systems that are used for controls, industrial controls or environmental controls, elevator systems, ACs, those are the targets because they're a nice foot in the door. And we actually have seen these in some of the investigations that I've worked on. Another thing that's important is what type of reconnaissance they're running against you. Are they doing direct scanning? Are they using a proxy? Are they bouncing that address and you can see that they did the first part of the port scan from one IP and the second half of the port scan from a different IP? That may be a more sophisticated operator. What's the volume, the quality, and the specificity of the scan? If somebody's doing you with a wide blast port scan and being very noisy about it, you probably don't need to worry about them. That's a cheap and automated scan. I'd be looking for the individual that's doing a quiet scan, high quality, and very specific. Maybe they're looking for just port 22, eBerry or Adore SSH. So maybe they're looking for vulnerabilities where they can plant an SSH rootkit. Also, web and application crawling. Look for techniques that they're using, efficiency and volume of the web crawling. This will tell you if they're able to find all of the places on a web server, places where maybe a URL manipulation would bring them up into a different structure of that website that normally wouldn't be accessible through normal URLs. And also metadata hunting. This is a great way to target, and I've used it many times. If you're not familiar with it, check out a tool called FOCA. I don't sell it. It's not anything for me, but it's a cool tool. And what it does is it will pull all of the files off of a website, Word documents, PDFs, Excel, anything, PowerPoint, anything that's out there. And for those of you that aren't aware, there's a ton of metadata stored in those files. If you look at a typical Microsoft file, it will have things like who wrote it originally, their email address, possibly, their IP address, who modified it last, where it was stored, what servers it was on, what directory it was on, every IP address of every printer that it was printed on, the names of those printers, the names of the servers in that environment. Again, people's phone numbers, names, email addresses. For somebody pretexting, this is great information. It helps build a map of your environment. So definitely want to look for that. But I would ask, if somebody's pulling all of the files off of your website, would you notice? Because what they may be doing is looking for metadata, and it's probably worth noticing. There's always more than one way to get to a target. So the question is, did the attacker discover a path to the target that you hadn't thought of? And that's another area where doing good reconnaissance discovery is helpful. And then again, social media, are employees being targeted? What might the attacker find? Passwords, corporate information, any relationship systems, defenses, like I said before, help chat rooms. On LinkedIn, people often put in LinkedIn, I work at such and such company, what am I a specialist in? And they list everything you've got in your environment. So I already know what type of firewalls you use, what type of IPS you use, what security controls you use, what types of servers you use, just based on looking at what your employees are telling me about their work experience at your environment. Something worth noting. And then advanced honeypots and deception networks. Modern honeypots have changed. These are not your grandfather's honeypots. The old ones were not multi-context, and they were pretty easy to detect. They didn't have anything that was changing. So new ones appear active. They have logs that are changing, files, users that are changing, and they look like related sets of systems, not a single server. The bottom line is somebody logs in and they see that they're on a VM and nothing's been changing in there for months. They know they're in a honeypot and they're going to bail out immediately. They also need to be moderately self-defending. So they need to appear to be active and defending. It's one of the best defenses, though, against a determined adversary, because a determined adversary is eventually going to breach the perimeter, as if there was a perimeter anymore, and be able to find something to attack. This helps draw them in. You can delay and distract them. In some cases, you can even do system context switching. So if you see an intruder attacking a live system, redirect them to the honeypot and switch the context of that live system into the honeypot. That way they think they're still on that same live system, and you can learn a lot about their techniques and tools. It's great for forensics as well. It helps you identify the target selection, their attack set techniques, what malware they're using, what you should be looking for in the rest of your environment. And some of these even have things like keystroke behavior. And the bottom line is, if I watch any of you type for 30 minutes, I could fingerprint you anywhere on the planet based on your error rate, type rate, command use and rate, command frequency, and so forth. So keyboard behavior is a good indicator. Another thing that's really useful to do is herding and traps. Here's an easy one to do, and I set this up within 10 minutes. The word confidential here, secret, top secret, these actually aren't words. They're bitmaps. I took the text, turned it into a bitmap, used Stego Magic to add a secret message into that image, and then used a hex editor to find where it had changed to create a unique signature. And then I could create an IPS signature for each one of these. I put this one maybe on the web server. So if somebody pops this, you put it on a web server in a place where they really shouldn't be able to get to, but a little URL manipulation can get them there, you know that somebody's trying. You put this on the backend database server and behind the web server, and you know that they've popped your web server and they're using it to leapfrog into the environment. Put this where the crown jewels are. Maybe name it something like merger and acquisition plan for 2020. kind of can guarantee that if a bad guy gets on that system, he's going to take that file. Now I get it. They're probably going to encrypt it. So you'll want to put the IPS right outside the door of that server, because more than likely they've popped some other system in your environment. They're going to pull the file off of that system with stolen credentials, bring it over to the system they compromised, then encrypt it and ship it out the door. So again, just a good way to know how far the intruder has made it into your environment and help you target systems. So now let's look at logging. So some interesting things you can find in the logs, and these often don't create necessarily events, but you'll want to look for new users, changes in user privileges, and also process privilege changes for those systems that don't have live users logging into them, that are process only, so they can use system accesses to get into that. Service starts and stops, especially if they're unexpected. But look for times when a service has stopped and restarted when you didn't do it. Software installs, gaps in time, there's a big one. If you're looking at the log file, and typically the application or the system logs every 30 seconds, and you see a 4-hour gap, well, that maybe was somewhere where a person who hacked into that system deleted that part of the log in order to prevent you from seeing their activities. Protocol errors, network protocol errors. Guess what? Malware is sometimes imperfect code. Hackers do not write perfect code necessarily, so they break things. So you'll see protocol errors, often memory errors, and then abnormal process termination. Again, malware interference. If that piece of malware interfered with a normally operating system, applications that were supposed to be there, or their process blew up because, again, their code wasn't perfect. Some other things, log statistics. Look at the log file version, sizes, last updates, create dates, for any anomalies there. If typically a log that comes out of a system, a weekly log that comes out of a system is half a gig, and 1 week it's only 200 meg, well, that might be an indication of a problem. Also look for typos and editing errors in the log. Guess what? Somebody going in and changing a log can make a typo. So you may see things that aren't right in there. And generally the application itself doesn't make typos. So look for editing errors and any type of typos in the log. So what are we looking for in memory? Well, in memory, we can search for processes, look at the path, the process name, version. I'm not talking about when you're in file management, you're looking at those dates. What I'm talking about is the actual date embedded in the running process, in the executable. You'll also want to look at the dynamic libraries that are being called. And again, the path, the version, the linked processes, the MD5. We'll talk a little bit more about MD5s in a minute, but there's some key things that you'll want to look for. System drivers. Again, the path. Where is it really? Not where you might think it's supposed to be. For example, sometimes people will take a file that normally lives in System 32 and drop it into the Windows directory. It's still the same file name and it looks all legit and it's in a Windows directory, but it's not in the directory that it's supposed to be. And you'll see that linkage in the system drivers and file versions and descriptions. You'll want to have the description for cross-reference back to the disk file. Some of the tools you can use, Process Explorer, Process Monitor, WinHacks, Microsoft Windows executables, but volatility is an excellent tool, one of my favorites. There will also be a need to get some specialized tools. And on the last session, we talked about what I call zombie malware, because it is zombie hard to kill. It is in the firmware of a motherboard. And for finding that, you'll need specialized tools like Benwalk. It's designed to look for binary images, embedded and executable code, but specifically things that are in firmware images. For example, if somebody pops a system, one of the places they might put malware would be, as an example, in the video driver chip, because you're not going to look there. Most malware search code isn't going to look there. And it's pretty much guaranteed that every time you boot up that system, it's going to get activated. So another place to look. What are we looking for on the disk? Well, on the disk, we'll look at registry keys, focus probably on the startup locations, and then the OS area of the file system. And again, this is where I'm talking about looking for things being not in the locations where they're supposed to be. Dates and times, look into the code for the date and time, not the one that's time-stamped on it that File Manager will show you. And same thing for file versions, and then again, the startup locations. There's a lot of tools for that, regedit, FTK Imager, SleuthKit. Some of these will help you find deleted files as well, because during the process of infestation, they may have intermediate malware that was there temporarily while a different malcode got downloaded. So you want to look at the things that were deleted as well. SleuthKit, good for that. Autopsy, and then PTK Forensics is an add-on for Autopsy. If you like command line operation, Autopsy is great. If you prefer a nice GUI interface, then maybe get PTK. There's HashKeeper, several other tools here that you can use to look at and analyze the disk drive. Take a little deeper look. Look for system files in atypical directories, subtle deviations in the file name. It's kind of like typo squatting. People will replace an I with a 1 or an L with an I and make it hard to visually see the difference in that file and hard to pick up on, and place things in, again, directories where they don't belong. Persistent locations, definitely look in services, run keys, active install keys, and then look for network indicators and new listening ports. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but one of the most common ways to set up a listening port is just to add a new service host. There are typically so many of them on a system that most people won't notice when a new one shows up. And since it's hard to figure out what they link to and what code they're actually running, even if you notice a new one, it's hard to know what it's doing. I'll show you a little bit about how to find that out in a few minutes. Command line arguments, searching files for command line arguments. They will often be in clear text, net use, net shell, command, password prompts, and then registry modifications. Are there scripts that are changing the registry, reg add, reg delete, and then some static indicators. Look for the compile date. Does it match the date on a verified system? One of the things I recommend is taking a benchmark system, identifying all of the processes and compile dates of critical system files on that, and then using that to match the compile date on your target systems. Create date. When was it created on the file system? The PE version number. What's the version of the internal version of the file? And here's the MD5 hash. Not just that it's matching, but it matches one on a known good system. If a hacker's not an idiot, they're going to take the MD5 and make it match their new code that they've added. So they're going to rerun the hash on it. So yes, it's going to match, but does it match a known good system is the real question. The PE section hash, can you find a match to any known malware? And then are there clear text strings in the executable code? An interesting thing, hackers tend to have pretty big egos and they like to brag about their exploits. They actually like to put notes in their executable code about their handle, who they are, not necessarily identifying their real name, but they'll put clear text strings in there. And sometimes they even put some humor in there, oh, about to take over the system or about to delete the sysadmins directory. So look for clear text strings that don't belong there as indicators. And then there are a number of tools here to use for static analysis, PE executables, tools like PE Investigator, PEID, PEView, WinHack, sysinternals, and a lot of those tools are in one place. This is a great tool to use because in just the forensics section alone, you've got a tremendous amount of resource for doing some of this analysis. Some common places in the registry. Look for services that are being set up. Run keys, obviously, current version run once, current Windows current version run, and then when login, again, looking for systems logins, current version when login, and then, of course, the startup folder. Great place to make sure that you have persistence, although in this day and age, it's a little bit obvious. And then system process evaluation. I told we talk a little bit more about that. And yes, I get it. This is 7. I'll show you 10 in just a second. But this is a good example. Once you pick a system process, you can click on the properties in detail and find out a little bit more about where it is, what its hash is, what directory it resides in. You can also go to the services and start linking this to the PID. With process ID, and if you can't find, if it's something where you really can't find enough information on it, click on a dump file, create a dump file, and go start looking through the code itself and figure out what you're dealing with. Once you have the PID, you've made that link to the service, you can record that PID and then find out what open ports are talking. Now, granted, it's all a little bit easier on Windows 10 because right in the process, they give you the PID right there. And you can do the same things, look at the details, look at the service, and create a dump if need be. Same thing here, it's a little easier in Windows 10. But in the end, what you're trying to get to is this. To find out all the listening ports on your system. Just because you're not actively communicating with a bad guy doesn't mean that you're not sitting there listening for his communications. So look at all the listening ports on the system and then map them back to what processes they are through the PID, and then find out what they really link to and what they're doing on your system. I kind of recommend doing this as an initial step on a target system and then look for changes over time. Also, purpose-built logs. So we talked about knowing your business and understanding what it is you're looking for. And in the last session, I said, stop asking what your logs are telling you and start asking the right questions. What is it you're looking for in the logs? And then decide whether or not the logs provide the data you need. Maybe you need to go into your applications and create custom log events. Do you need additional log sources? Specifically, is what you're looking for detectable at all? Or is it a needle in a haystack? And then the question becomes, can you separate it out from the rest of the noise? So now let's look at how you can leverage an integrated threat management system. So most, and I use our company as an example, most companies, when they're setting up a SOC, they're pulling information from the customer environment, logs from the customer environment, doing some analysis on that. But what you really need to do is have a system that links in threat intel. We talked about the value of threat intel, pulling in social media, dark web, open source intel, DNS reputations, IP, threat actor campaigns, and feed that the net flow, DNS queries, IP ranges, employee information, deception systems, partners, industry, and data classes. If they have partners, if the partners attack, that could be the way in the door. Think supply chain attacks, very common these days. Next, what else can I add to this? Deception network, linked to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Well, that'll help me understand what I'm seeing in the threat intel, so I can map that back. If I see somebody attacking one of these deception network targets, I can look at the type of technique they use and then map that maybe back to the threat actor. Also, if I know that a particular threat actor is targeting me, I can go, and I know what malware they like to use, I can go ahead and set up a deception network that is vulnerable to that exploit so that I can entice them in. And then attack surface analysis, another critical part of the puzzle. If I see a type of attack that may be being launched, I can then go evaluate, am I susceptible to that attack? Or do I have vulnerabilities for that exploit? Again, same thing, tying all three of these pieces together. But as you go further, you'll want to tie in the endpoint. Look at the detection there. What am I seeing from my endpoints? Does that give me a clue where else to look? Because again, I need to constantly evolve my threatscape for the intruder hunting program. Also want to pull in cloud environment. If somebody's attacking me locally, they're probably going to go after my cloud sources or vice versa. And also automated red team. Let's say I understand that from my threat intel that there's a threat actor planning on attacking, and I know the type of malware they're using. Well, gee, it might be a good idea to go find out if I'm susceptible to that attack. First, try using my attack surface analysis and vulnerability management system to look for vulnerabilities, but also go ahead and launch that attack and see if it works. See where the gaps are to try and detect those simulations, draw them into the deception network, and also detect them back and create responses. Last but not least, be able to create automated responses so that in the end, when an attacker does come in, they get pulled into the deception network, I detect the attack, and then I can actually actively block it. So let's talk about operationalizing all of this process. First, when do you report an intrusion? Well, that can be complicated, but one thing's for sure, it needs to be well scripted and documented how you're going to do that. The chief legal officer, probably one of the first people on the list as part of that process. For information dissemination, they are going to need to know what's our liability and who else do I notify? Do I need to make this a public notification? What are my legal requirements? Are you sure there was an intrusion, or is it just suspected? That's a critical question because announcing it a little bit early and giving misinformation or incomplete information may be worse than no information. It's kind of like yelling fire in a theater. Another thing you need to know is, has data been compromised or exfiltrated already? Or are they just still doing the data acquisition phase of the kill chain? Are they still looking around, trying to get lateral movement, persistence? What part of the kill chain are they in? If you delayed doing something, what's a possible cost? Will they get more value out of it from their perspective? Will they start damaging things? Or could you let them stay there for a while and figure out what exactly they're after? And can you report an intrusion without being forced into action? This is where that thing I call reporting trust is critical. If you go to your senior management and you say, we think we have an intrusion on system XYZ right here, if their first response is going to be clean that up, delete that system, flatten it out and rebuild it, that's probably a bad place to be in. What they need to do is ask you, what should we do about that? And trust you when you say, well, we don't see that they've actually started exfiltrating data. We don't think they've even found our goodies. We're going to let them sit there for a while and see if we can figure out how they got in and what they're after. Is production being affected? Well, that could be a deciding factor. Are partners being affected? That could be also a deciding factor, in that if you've got business partners and a system that's compromised talks to those business partners, you don't want to be impacting them. And can you establish a good recovery point? Can you say, I know somebody's in this system, but here's the place I'm going to recover from. I'm going to look back this far in time, and when I do pull the trigger on it, this is what my loss is going to be. Who do you report to? Well, that can also be complicated, but again, needs to be well scripted and documented. The chief legal officer, again, is what is the top recommendation. There are potential legal compliance issues, PR ramifications. Do the system owners need to take any action? Are they going to need to rebuild their systems? What data do they need to restore? Do they need to reset any accounts? Will there be any downtime or production impacts during the actual eviction? Are partners going to be affected? And did the infection come from a partner? Doesn't really sound right. Are user accounts compromised? How critical are they? Can all of them be reset at the same time? And also, do you have to notify law enforcement? What about shareholders? Will there be legal action? I would say one of the first things you want to do is establish a need-to-know protocol. So executives, they need to know certain things. That includes legal, the business and financial impact. What damages and losses will there be? Regulatory compliance impact. One of the things I'd ask is, do you have a chief compliance officer? That would probably be in the chain of notification. Any litigation impact? Is there a potential for legal action against the organization? What executives really need to know, though, is assurance that corrective action's been taken and that it's not going to happen again. They do not need to know the technical details of the intrusion. Again, reporting trust. And here's an example. I was sitting at the airport last year and having lunch at an airport between flights. And I heard these two guys, obviously executives at a company, and they were talking about the details of a breach they had had at their company, going through details about how it happened, what had been compromised, how they thought the intruders got in. And guess what? I look down and look at their bags. Their name tags are right on the bag. I know their company, I know what general positions they had, and I know how they were attacked and what was compromised. It's bad form. There needs to be a need to know protocol so that the wrong people don't get their hands on the information. System owners, for example, they need to know what systems were impacted, of course, and the nature of any damages. And they also need to know what recovery processes need to be followed to restore operations. And they need to understand any corrective actions they have to keep that from happening in the future. Same type of thing for the network and the bulk of the security personnel and infrastructure folks. They need to know what corrective actions they need to take to prevent it happening again, and any new processes and procedures. And then end users, as little as possible, because they will talk, they will put it in social media, they will tell their friends. If you want to keep this information contained, don't tell anybody anything they don't absolutely need to know. Let's talk about when to report. So you've got kind of a similarity with pirates when talking about when to notify on a breach. It's kind of like knowing when to raise the pirate flag. You raise it too soon, they might run, they get away. You raise it too late, they might panic and start shooting, men will be lost, and you'll be forced to sink the prize. So knowing when to report is critical. I say ask the following in this order. What's the current state of the damage or loss? You know the depth and breadth of the intrusion. Have the intruders set traps or landmines? Sometimes hackers are not nice people. They will actually set up landmines for you, so when you start evicting them from your environment, things start blowing up, aka files get encrypted, systems get deleted. So understanding that element of it is kind of key to starting the eviction. Do you understand how they got in? That's really critical, because if you don't understand how they got in, odds are they're going to come back. Are you confident that you can expel them completely and block that re-entry? And do you understand their target, their value proposition, their game plan? Because if you don't understand the people that were attacking you and what they were trying to accomplish, again, odds are they'll be back and they'll be back in. Is there value in monitoring? What can you learn about them by letting them stay a little bit longer? Now let's talk about the actual eviction process. First, it needs to be well documented and standardized. I think I've made that point about every part of the process. Second, don't make this killing James Bond. Okay, take the Scott Evil approach. I've got a gun up in my room, Dad, we can just shoot him. The idea is that the more elaborate you make the eviction process, the greater your chances of making a mistake or a failure. Document all the known inhabited systems. Did you discover an expendable asset? I think we talked about that last time, that often an attacker will get several systems within your environment, and then they'll test one of them for data extrusion, so an exfiltration. They'll try and send something out on an expendable asset. So when you see this system trying to send data out of your environment, you realize that it's compromised, you go find some malware on it, your natural response is to clean that up. But the problem is you need to look at a number of things, like, is that the only system? Are there persistence methods already in there? Do they have backdoors already set up? And where was the original point of entry? And also take a look at the signaling. And I would consider trying to falsify that signal. If you look at the phone home messages of that system, see if you can decode them, and then create false phone home message systems. And also look for that same phone home messaging in anything else in your environment to find out if there are other compromised systems that you don't know about. Look at their lateral communications as well. You'll want to find out if you actually know all of the systems that are compromised, so you can clean it all up at once. In the end, the attackers often have a console, and all of the systems they own in your environment have a little green light next to them. If a couple of them start turning red, they could counterattack. What you want to do is make all those icons stay green until they all turn red at the same time and they're out. Plan for the removal. Are system rebuilds going to be necessary? Are they in the firmware? Is it a pull the motherboard out and throw it away and get a new one? Will reboots be necessary? How about downtime? And then plan for post-eviction system cleanliness monitoring. You'll want to look at configuration changes and behavior of those systems at least 72 hours after the eviction process to make sure that you got everything. And again, any of those phone home messages, start looking for those to see if they're coming from any systems post-eviction. And again, ideally, you've got quarantine, use a portable firewall, build custom rules, only allow the system to do the bare minimum what it needs to do, and put the firewall right in front of that system. Lastly, a little bit on counterattacks. If you're thinking about a counterattack, I want you to remember you're not Batman. Okay? Batman isn't running a business. Batman has a secret identity. Batman doesn't have a public-facing internet presence that could be DDoSed. Batman has billions of dollars in nearly infinite informational resources. Hey, Batman's got a high-ranking local law enforcement friend who's actually willing to violate the law to protect Batman. Batman isn't afraid of being fined or doing prison time. Batman actually wants to start a war with organized criminals. But most importantly, Batman isn't real. So none of that applies to you. If you're thinking about retaliatory strike, let's talk about your legal options. You can do takedown requests. You could put malware in your environment for them to upload. It's called a logic bomb. And once it gets into their environment, the hacker's environment, they steal it, they get into their environment, and then it deletes all of their files or encrypts their system. Counter hacking is not legal, at least in most countries. Do not try to hack their environment as a counterattack. And when you think about those logic bombs and letting them upload malware, give that real serious thought, because again, you don't really want to start a war with organized criminals. They know who you are. You don't know who they are. You've got more to lose than they do in that kind of battle. Now, some of you, we've only got a few minutes left. Some of you are probably thinking, this guy's a bit of a nerd. So I've got one more slide where I'm going to prove you right. First, you may not have noticed, but all of my slides are numbered in prime numbers. And there was a statement on there where I said, there's two sides to every equation, but they're not always equal. And that formula that was up there is actually wrong by just a little bit. It was taken from Homer Simpson's solving of Fermat's last theorem in the Wizard of Evergreen Terrace. You can see that formula here. I'll let you read the theorem itself. There was one slide, though, that wasn't a prime number. By the way, it was 91, and it's an interesting number still. On that same slide where I had Fermat's last theorem being solved by Homer Simpson, there was also a reference saying there's more than one way to get someplace to any target. And that's a reference to a taxi number. It's a sum of two cubes, two ways. And the smallest taxi number is 1729. But the reason 91 is an interesting number and not a prime number is because it's the smallest taxi number derived using non-positive integer bases. And that formula is here. That equation is there. Last but not least, when I was talking about where things get interesting out on the edges of the bell curve, the 0.2% or plus or minus 3 sigma. So that indeed it is where the data gets interesting, because the rare communications, the low and slow stuff is generally the most interesting. And with that, I think we're about at our time for the the talk. I don't know if Howard, if you've been able to get back on. All right, that means I can't see any of the questions that might have come up. So with that, I will end the presentation, and I thank you all very much for attending.